Hello, I'm Tim Wilmot, a watercolor artist, and in this video, in this tutorial demonstration, I'm going to show you how to paint a market scene. This is Castillon in southwest France. Lovely sunny day. It's actually a Monday, which is the market day in Castillon. Castillon, for any history buffs, was the site of the last battle of the 100 Years' War between England and France, but a lot more peaceful now. So a lovely scene, very sunny day, lots of shadows, quite a lot of different techniques that we can use from a watercolor point of view. What attracted me to this scene was, well, first of all, the high range in values. Look at the dark shadows that we've got, the lighter building in the background, the lighter street, the walkway in the middle. We've got a few figures as well to add some interest to the scene. Of course, any market scene has to include lots of figures in it. The more, the better, potentially. We've also got an element of perspective as well. Look at this right-hand building leading us down into the scene. Also the shadows, in a way, these angular shadows, they're sort of leading the eye into the scene as well. But on that building, the right-hand side, the light's catching out some lovely triangular shadows. Do you see those? Yeah, so lots of different things of interest. Sunny day, light and shade, light and dark, lots of contrasts, a pretty scene, lots of things that we can look at and think about from a composition point of view. Do we remove things? Do we add things? One strikingly obvious thing I would remove is this yellow. I'm not actually sure what this yellow van is. I think it might have been selling roasted chickens at the end of rotisserie chickens at the end of the street there. But obviously that's a thing. The angle of it is just not doing anything for the composition. So that's one. The main obvious thing I will be removing from the scene. Now, as I go through this painting, if you want to keep this reference photo in view, you could always open this in a new tab or pause the video now and then go to a new tab or a new browser window and start the video again, and then you can just alternate between the two, just to use that as a reference point, going backwards and forwards from the source photo to my demo. So let's see how we get on. The paper I'm using for this demo is Saunders Waterford cold press paper texture. So and it's 300 grams in weight. It's sort of medium texture, middle roughness, which will give us a nice texture to some dry brush strokes that we do in the painting. And it's taped down onto some lightweight board. I've got a slight angle to the board, so when I start painting, there will be a little bit of gravity to help me with the wash and so on. So first step is getting in the main shapes of the market scene. So I've started with the top left corner, and on the left hand side, one of the main parasols, umbrellas that come out. In the middle, we've got the building at the end of the street that's catching a little bit of the light. On the right hand side, I've got my first angle for perspective to that top right angle. Quite important to get that top angle right, and then maybe looking at street level. What is the angle there? Think of these angles as degrees, degrees off the vertical or horizontal, whatever, but keep it consistent, or maybe hours of a clock. So that top right corner, that's almost 45 degrees. The one I've just done is more sort of 30, 35 degrees off the horizontal, that sort of thing. Now, I mentioned the angular shadows going across the street that are being created by the market stalls here. They're quite important because they are giving us a lot of different values in the scene. Their shape is leading us into the scene as well. So I have drawn those in. Sometimes I will draw in the outline of a shadow. Sometimes I'll leave it, and when I come onto the painting stage, I'll then go for it. So these are important, so I've got to get those in. I have to include some figures. So here are just a few, a handful. We'll have them at different positions in the scene as well. Some in the background, some in the middle ground. I think if I had something in the foreground, I don't know, I'm sort of 50-50 on having a nearby figure in the foreground and maybe just only showing part of them, because if they were so close to us, it just might be a little bit too distracting. I want the main object, the main topic of this painting to be the left-hand side and the right-hand side leading us in. Another strong line there just to get in this key left-hand side. That's the sort of the main shelves, if you like, where the produce is. On the right, back on the right-hand side, there's a secondary line below the top of the building. Some architectural detail and just an indication of a few windows as well. End of the street, the street line. The pencil I'm using is it's a 3B pencil, so it's a soft pencil, quite dark lines. Some of them may show in the end painting, which I don't really mind, but it's just really to get in those main shapes there, and being dark enough so that I can see. If I go in with a fairly dark wash, I can still pretty much see what's going on there. So that is the first step, getting in that drawing, and that's quite a crucial phase. Well, going before that, choice of the scene. Many photographs I take aren't particularly suitable, or when I look at them again, they're not particularly suitable for painting from. They might make for a very nice photograph as regards their composition or lighting, but they don't really strike me as a very interesting painting, so I'll dismiss them. But this one, it did catch my fancy for the points I've mentioned already. And yes, that's the main thing. And then the second thing is getting the drawing, getting that initial drawing absolutely right. So I'm on the second phase now, doing the initial wash, as I normally do. Start off with the sky, fairly intense sky, a bright blue, which was a combination of, was mainly cobalt blue, a nice bright blue there. And then these buildings. Now I've gone over the sky line with the sky wash, and now I'm using a bit of yellow ochre to do the buildings with, trying to replicate the colors of these French buildings in this market scene. And also I like to alternate some of the colors and the hues that we've got in this area, which I need to in a large area. I can't have it too all the one tone. I've got to keep alternating things, and that's what I'm doing here. Brush strokes in different directions, picking up a little bit of extra color, maybe going back into it, adding in color as it's still damp, so it's not too mono in one color. So down the left hand side, could be anything really. A lot of this left hand area is going to be quite dark, so I'm just really trying to cover most of the paper here, apart from around some of the figures or light areas that I want to leave unpainted. I'll paint around those. Now the brush I'm using in this first phase is a mop brush. So this has, it's a big head to it. This is a Raphael soft aqua brush. It's a synthetic brush. It's got very good water retaining features, and which is what you need when you're doing a wash. You don't want to have to keep going back into your mixing well and making up some extra color. You want to keep things, you want to keep that momentum going in this first phase, and you don't want to have to keep going back in and mixing more paint, and then you're coming back onto the paper, and where you're continuing up, where you're continuing on to paint, suddenly the paint's dried that you were painting before, so you end up with maybe a nasty edge. So it's all still quite damp. We've got this momentum going, and so we want a brush that's got a maximum water retaining capability. And as I say, we're covering over most of the painting, apart from those areas that are going to be deliberately light. For example, like some of the figures here as well. And this street surface, this will be it. I'm not going to go over this again. Like the sky, invariably the sky and the road in these street scenes that I do, I just paint them once, and I'll never go over them again, apart from the shadows going over them or maybe some little details. So doing it once, like the sky, just alternating my directions of my brush strokes with this large brush. Maybe slightly unorthodox, those brush, the way I'm using the brush. A lot of people would, using a wash, would just gradually come down the page with say a bead of paint, adding more paint on each of these horizontal lines and gradually letting gravity do its own thing as it's coming down. But I prefer to use these different brush strokes to go in all sorts of different directions there. Now I need to let everything dry 100% before going on to the next stage. And the reason behind that is that we don't want any nasty reactions to when I go on with the darker colors. I want to have control over the edges, and I want to have a better control. If I started painting if I started going with darker colors while the paint is still moist or damp, I'm not going to get the hard edges. We might have some nasty cauliflowers occurring where we don't want them to occur. So I've got to let everything dry completely. And I will use a hairdryer to speed up the process. Now, if you do like these videos and you want to have a go yourself, I do have a presence on Patreon. Now, up on Patreon, that's a very popular site for lots of creators to share their work. And on my Patreon site, the address is patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, Wilmot. Every month or so, I set some painting projects where I'll pick different subjects, different themes every month, and then set you a task to paint that. You send in your painting to me, and I'll send you back, by return, I'll send you back a video critique. A little sort of 2-minute video going over your painting, hopefully giving you some extra hints and tips to help you improve your watercolor techniques. So that's the Patreon site, and also in between whiles I do post up lots of extra material, some of which may not be, I don't post anywhere else. I tend to stick to either YouTube or my website or a little bit on Twitter. I don't really do much on Facebook or Instagram. So mainly because of time, I just can't post to all and share what I'm up to. So yeah, Patreon. Have a look at Patreon if you've never looked at it before. See what you think, and yeah, if you want to join in those monthly projects, you'd be very welcome. So everything is drying nicely. It does go a lighter color. So well, for example, that sky was pretty blue. It's gone down a level or two now in the depth of the color. So that's what's going to happen. Is sometimes you've got to overcompensate that when you're going in with your washes, try and go a little bit darker than you think. So now I'm going in with darker colors. I'm using again a smaller mop brush. This is a Raphael Soft Aqua size 4 brush, this one I think, and starting with the roof at the end of the street. It's always good to have something where your eyes are leading down a street or across a view. It's always good to have something at the end of the street to sort of stop the eye, a bit like a full stop at the end of a sentence. It sort of stops, and there's some kind of finality to it rather than ad infinitum go viewing into the distance. So that's why that was quite important to have. Well, that's what attracted me to the scene is that building down there at the end. Now there's a striking blue, a darker blue parasol coming over from the left-hand side, sort of in the middle ground, I would guess it is. So that's that. Again, it will dry lighter, so I have to go a little bit more intense than I think. Now the right hand parasol, I've used a bit of lavender. I've got a sort of opaque, chalky paint here to get in this sort of grayish, coolish market stall blind here. And yeah, a little bit of that lavender is, I think it's a Holbein lavender. It's quite nice. You should give it a try. It's quite nice for skies as well. A little bit of lavender rather than blue. Put in a bit of lavender, and as I say, it's sort of, to me, it's sort of a little bit chalky. It's a bit like if I had to make it, it would be perhaps a little bit of cerulean blue, a bit of white gouache, and maybe a very tiny bit of alizarin crimson to get that colour. Now the start of this market stall on the left hand side. It's pretty dark on the left hand side, but I don't want it to be all one dark color. I've got to try and alternate things, so I've got some, well, I'm starting there, just a few verticals. I'm painting around a few little incidental bits of the paper left unpainted as well, just to create a few little sparkles or just something extra in there. And this mop brush, I should say that these mop brushes that I use, they've got quite a good edge to them. That's very important on a brush, is to the point, having a point to a brush is quite important, but having a good edge is probably more important, because at least with an edge you can, by twisting it, you can actually paint in things as if you had a point to your brush. But this edge is very important in a brush. And also with this darker color, I'm alternating between some warms and some cools. So the blue and the red, do you see? Just to introduce a bit of extra interest in there. Now, coming down to street level, I'm going a lot darker still. Right at the top there, you just saw me use some neutral tint. Maybe a little bit too dark for that distant area. That could have gone a bit lighter there, but it's got to be dark to create a little bit of impact with the contrast of the lighter buildings, the lighter street with these dark shadows going across the street. This is why it's important to have a good edge, to be a bit more precise with the painting and getting in those sharper edges here and there. Gradually coming towards me, you can just about see that edge now on that brush. Do you see it? It's quite a good edge. Bit of cobalt blue, that middle one. This palette, so that was neutral tint again. Very often I'll mix on the paper, but let me describe my palette from the top. Neutral tint, then burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green. And then in the middle is a cerulean blue, then cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, a Windsor red, light red, two up from the bottom, cadmium orange, and a lemon yellow. Now the shadow on the far side of this parasol, and there's a jagged edge to it. So hopefully this now is starting to look a little bit more realistic as a market stall on the right hand side. I'm fairly regularly looking at the scene as I'm painting this and looking for the shapes of objects primarily, and then hopefully they appear a little bit more realistic. Now, I'm being quite careful with that figure. And twist the brush just to get that sharp edge again. A few quick horizontals just to define and maybe just to give the impression of some light hitting some of the produce on that stall. You can see the sort of retention of water on this brush. I've very rarely had to go back to my water and pick up a little bit of extra water. Yeah, it's quite good. Now, the left-hand edge of that shadow's got a little bit of an edge, a little bit of a curve to it. So that's why I've just done that. Also a slightly lighter horizontal line between the two areas of shadow as well. Maybe a little gap between two parasols is creating that line there. What I'm doing now is the shadow underneath the roof on the far building. And I'll still alternate the value of the shadow as well as I'm going across. Now the building to the right of it, that also has got some darker shadow underneath the roof. There we go there. Up to and creating a sharp edge to that building on the right hand side. Check my edge on the brush. Could have used a smaller brush here, but as I feel it's all going okay with the edge on this brush, I can sneak in a little thin horizontal line there with that thicker brush. Thinner brush now for some more precise work, more detail work. So this is a synthetic round brush. And I'm trying to make a nice green now for the tree in the top left corner. And I use different brushes for foliage. Sometimes I use a sword liner brush or a dagger brush. That can give you some nice foliage effects. Or sometimes I'll use an older medium-sized mop brush that has lost its point and sort of splay out the hairs rather like a chimney sweep brush, so you can get some interesting random foliage effects with that when the brush is not too well loaded with paint, fairly dry. Or in this case, using this synthetic brush, it can take a fair bit of punishment, you know, with the brush strokes on the paper. So I'm going in sort of all different types of directions here. Quite dark, as I'm coming down. It needs to be dark against that blue. But you can see in a sort of random way, I've started fairly dense on the left-hand side. And as I come over, I'm introducing a few more spaces between these, the leaves and the branches, becoming a bit more sparse. And just a few little specks and dots coming almost to the middle of the scene. So just dabbing over the paper, coming down a little bit onto that blue parasol as well. Neutral tint and a bit of burnt umber. The brush is still quite dry, not too moist, but get a dark line under that rooftop and a few windows on the far building. So those would be, when I do two lines like that, they're kind of just giving impression of a pair of shutters. Building on the right-hand side, so burnt umber, neutral tint again. Hopefully those two lines there, that'll help with the perspective. So going a little bit narrow down towards the distance. Some more important windows. I didn't draw them all in when I first did my drawing. Perhaps I should have done, just to get them absolutely right. But with a little bit of practice, you can sort of draw them in freehand, as I've done here. Now, there are these quite nice triangles of shadow, and that immediately gives the impression of, well, not only the dark sunlight, but it gives the impression of the recess of the window area as well. So giving a bit of form. It's not too flat, that building. On that parasol, just change some of add in a few little marks there just to dirty it up so it's not too clean and tidy. Slightly lighter value here. Have a distant market stall. I could actually have done this before the darker market stall that's nearer to us, because in watercolor you're always trying to go with each of your washes or stages, you're going darker and darker and darker. So you start off with the lights and then you end up with the darker darks. I could have done that. I could have sneaked in that initially, but doesn't matter. There's a little bit lighter in value, just a little bit, compared to the nearby stall on the right hand side. Checking with my fingertips just to see how dry everything is. You can sort of see with the surface if you hold it up against the light. If it's still glistening, it's a little bit too wet, or the paper surface isn't flat enough, it's sort of crinkly, then you can tell, yeah, well, it's a little bit too damp to proceed. So back to that medium size mop brush. Fairly dark, neutral tint, ultramarine blue. Add a bit of definition and darkness to the bottom of this left-hand market stall. Neutral tint, ultramarine blue, not too much water, and it's still a little bit damp on the left-hand side, so I need to be a bit careful with my hand. I don't smudge anything as I'm painting over it. And it's definitely still quite moist on the right hand side. You can still see there's a little bit of glistening on the paint. Ultramarine blue, bit of neutral tint. Mix it anywhere. And that's the bottom of that parasol that's coming out. And it's okay going over some of the shop blinds here, these parasols. I don't want them to be sort of too isolated and not connected. I need to join up these different elements. Now I need to cover up that space between that blue rectangular parasol coming out and the top of the leading edge of that roof coming down the left hand side. So I need to cover up that space there. Figures. I painted around those figures. What I'll do first of all is paint in their heads, limbs, and then perhaps a shirt or something like that. If they're going to be a little bit darker, I might leave them white. Sometimes I'll leave them white, especially against a darker background for a little bit of impact. Or this one, now this one is against a light background, so why not make it dark against a light background? Having done the figure, put in a shadow figure, so the light's coming from left to right. I didn't draw in, so I drew in the main shadow areas of the market stalls, but not the figures, because those shadows, the light going from left to right, they're going to be quite thin, those shadows, so there's really no point getting them in. Just having the indication of where the legs are, that's fine. We can then sort of freehand get in the figure shadows. Now, far figures. couple of figures at the end. I keep checking the edge on that brush. Quite a dry brush, quite some dry brush marks now. Insert another figure in the far market stall, or a little bit of objects here and there. Notice they're just slightly lighter in value than the nearby figures, which I think is important just to push those figures back a bit. There are a few horizontal lines going across from side to side, so just a few of those, and then, as I often do in a street scene like this, a few dry brush marks just to help the eye going into the scene. This is the lower part of the market stall, blind. Add some form to the left-hand side. Being on the very perimeter of the painting, I don't want to put too much detail in there. I want the focus to be this lighter area in the middle, and the figures leading down to the building at the end. So yeah, be fairly brief with anything on the sides. Just thought I needed a bit more foliage to that tree, just to extend it a bit more to the right. A few lines just to give those rooftops some form. With rooftops and buildings, I paint in a loose style, which some people like to paint loose, some people like to paint a bit more tighter, a bit more precise, and an exact representation of what they're trying to paint. So they might paint almost every brick on a house and every tile on a roof. Yeah, I prefer just to give the impression of a few lines on that rooftop. Not too many. Otherwise, if you overdo it, it just overemphasizes that point, and it just doesn't look right. So just a few vertical lines on that rooftop, that's fine. I'm covering in these lighter areas here with a bit of darkness, representing produce on this market stall. And then counter with some darker areas above or just below the market stall cover. Again, just using my fingertips to maybe do a little bit of smudging. The paint is starting to dry off, but it's still got a little bit of dampness to it, so I can move things around a bit. I could still, if I change my mind, I could still go in and lift some off, or go in with a darker pigment to get some softer edges. Perhaps a bit more form to the figures. If I want to add in some darker leggings or a little bit of shadow to them, ideal with this smaller brush. I'm just now going around the painting, just adding in some little bits of detail if I can think of them. So this figure with a bag. Of course, this is a market scene, so I need at least one or two figures carrying something. Just dry the left-hand side with my hairdryer just to speed up the process a bit. So we'll be going on, we'll use a little bit of white gouache to add in a few highlights to the scene, but I need to make sure that it's all 100% dry before doing that, otherwise it just goes a little bit weak and a little bit greyish if you do that. So a little bit of white gouache, just a little bit where it's maybe the sunlight's catching a few things, a few objects in the stall, a few verticals, not too much. Some of these lines are lost and found. They're not continuous lines. There might be a bit of a line, then a gap, bit of a line, then a gap. So found and lost, lost and found. This middle parasol's got a bit of fancy trim on it. Likewise on the right hand side. Just makes it a little bit different, just picking up a few little lines like this. Of course, with the supporting rods of the parasol, there might be a few lines catching the light. So that's what I've done there. Particularly useful against a darker background. Yeah, I'm putting in some light areas around the frames of the houses, but you can't really see that too much. You're going to notice it more against a darker background, of course. Tiny bit on the figures where they're catching the light. And a lighter line just to maybe something metallic catching the light on that left-hand side. That whole left-hand side is quite abstract now. It's sort of, yeah, it's coming on, I think, quite nicely. So what I'll do now is pop over to the finished painting, and let's just go through again the stages the stages and steps of the painting. So here's the finished painting. A sunny day, market scene in Castillon in southwest France. Lots of lighter areas and darker areas. From a composition point of view, we've got a left-hand edge, we've got a right-hand edge, we've got lots of lines leading us into the scene. So from the left-hand side, we've got this large market stall, some lines taking us into the scene of the stall, and then the shadows of the stall going along there. And on the right-hand side, the top of the building. Soft edges as well, lots of different edges in the watercolor. When I did the sky, and I went over the edges of the buildings, and then I painted the actual building itself in that yellow ochre. Went up to the sky. I'm not creating any cauliflowers or blossoms. I mean, the trick there is the mix that you use, the mix that I used for the wall would have been slightly thicker, just ever so much thicker than the sky. So it's going to behave itself. It's not going to start creeping up the page. And also, I've got the board on a slight slope, so the top is higher than the bottom. It's going to, with a bit of gravity, that's going to assist you. I used lavender for this parasol, bit of a chalky, opaque-ish colour, not transparent at all. Lovely colour to use. As I said, that, it could be quite nice for some skies as well. Different effect on the skies rather than just using blue. But I think the main thing about this painting is the lights and the darks. So, we've got those lighter figures at the end. Perhaps that could be a focal point. Your eye, when you first look at the scene, your eye is here, or maybe it starts down here and you see these dark lines going into the scene, taking you on a journey through to the scene. And then the building at the end, that full stop, stopping the eyes. So it's we then start to wander around left and right. The effect of the foliage as well. I mentioned the 3 different brushes or techniques I might use for foliage. This time I just used a synthetic brush. Hope you like it. Look forward to getting your comments. Catch up with you on the next video.